She opened the door to receive some flowers, and before she could even take them in her hands, she was shot and killed.
You know, normal people are puzzled over how someone else who acts and looks normal could be so vicious, could commit such an evil, immoral act.
He would call me, tell me that he's gonna kill me.
The individual behind it is a cold, calculating killer.
It was my responsibility to find out what had happened to that person, who did it, and bring him to justice.
It's a cool January morning in the exclusive Buckhead district of Atlanta, Georgia. Often described as the jewel of the city, this quiet community will soon learn that a single act of violence can shatter their peaceful lives and set in motion one of the most torturous investigations the city has ever seen.
The lady received a call, a man not seen before in the neighborhood. Somebody wanted to get her the door to shoot her, to do harm to her.
At 8:20 in the morning, Atlanta police receive a frantic call from Buckhead resident Bob Christensen. His neighbor, a well-known socialite named Lita Sullivan, has been shot in the head. First responders quickly descend on the scene, followed by the homicide unit. The victim, barely hanging on to life, is rushed to the nearest hospital. She's alive, but unable to speak. It's now up to investigators to tell her story.
When you're working a homicide, you're listening and watching at the same time. And I'm surveying the crime scene, and I can see for myself what had transpired. There were shell casings lying on the floor, one just inside the front door and one behind the front door. It's obvious that the person who came to the door and delivered the flowers shot her. She had a chance to retreat into her house because she got about maybe 12 or 15 feet back into her house before she was hit. Matter of fact, it looks like, from my experience, like she might have been trying to get back up the steps, but she was unable to do so.
Lying on the floor is a grisly Valentine, a box of long-stemmed pink roses.
Obviously, there were bullet holes on the inside. We looked for shell casings. We looked for additional fingerprints. We looked for any bits and pieces of evidence that might help us to solve the crime.
Stranger still is an item found just a few feet away. It's a postcard from a friend of the family named Ed Wheeler, and the card reads that he will not be able to testify at Lita's upcoming divorce hearing.
I didn't know whether the postcard was related to the incident or not. I didn't know. When you hear that somebody has a court hearing that same day and something like this happened, and you begin to think, what if? So that's where we were.
Then, inside one of the upstairs closets, investigators make their most startling discovery yet.
One of Lita Sullivan's best friends, Poppy Marable, was actually in the condominium.
Mrs. Marable was there with Mrs. Sullivan and spent the night with her.
Visibly shaken, Poppy explains to police that she and Lita had both been on the second floor when the flower delivery man arrived. But Lita went downstairs by herself to sign for them.
She heard the noise from the shot. She immediately locked herself in the room, and she sort of panicked. She didn't know what had taken place. It was not unusual, in my opinion, for her to kind of just stay put until help arrived.
She claims to have no idea who the assailant was since she never saw his face. But while Poppy is helpful, at this stage, police can't rule anything out.
I don't know what we have. I know we have, while at the scene, I found out that she had expired at the hospital. Then I knew we had a homicide. And it was my responsibility to find out what had happened, who did it, and bring them to justice.
Next, investigators bring Lita's neighbor, Bob Christensen, in for questioning, since he was the one who called police in the first place. Still reeling from his neighbor's death, he reconstructs the series of events leading up to the 911 call.
Well, Mr. Christensen saw a man who was strange to the neighborhood, but he had an eerie feeling about the man. The man did not have a pleasant countenance about him. And he stared at him, and stared at him to the point where it frightened him.
Unnerved, Christensen decides to mind his own business. But just moments later, he gets the shock of his life.
He heard the shot. He saw the man exit, and he went to Lita's door, and that's when he found Mrs. Sullivan lying in the floor, wounded.
Christensen gives authorities their first big break in the case, a detailed description of the assassin. But investigators know it's too early to point the finger at any one person, yet.
Everybody at that point is a person of interest. I can't eliminate anybody because I don't know anything about anybody.
In January of 1987, Atlanta police are investigating the brutal murder of socialite Lita Sullivan, who was gunned down in her home after accepting flowers from a delivery man.
We were pretty convinced that when the crime occurred, it occurred very quickly. So I doubt very seriously if there was enough time for anybody to go in to commit a robbery.
But with just a composite sketch of the shooter to go on, authorities continue to question Lita's friends for any information on who might have wanted her dead.
Most homicides are not solved by DNA, bloody fingerprints, computer records, cell phone records. Most homicides that are solved because people talk. People who know about the crime talk about it.
Lita's best friend, Poppy Marable, informs police that Lita and her husband Jim were in the middle of a messy divorce after a turbulent 11-year marriage. She goes on to say that she wouldn't be surprised if he had something to do with the murder.
Whenever you have a woman who's murdered and she's been going through a nasty divorce, right away the husband would pop up.
Detectives soon trace Jim Sullivan to Palm Beach, Florida, where he's been living since he and Lita split up 2 years earlier.
He indicated he was home alone that morning and actually took a couple of phone calls.
According to her estranged husband,
Hello.
Lita had been doing a lot of partying and had dated several men since their separation. He suggests that any one of them could have something to do with her murder.
When you have multiple friends and partners, that elevates the risk. And so the circles you travel in, your lifestyle, your habits, your routine, all contribute to a much higher risk and level of vulnerability and potential many more suspects. And we had to explore all of these.
Ms. Sullivan was the type of person that she knew a lot of people, her parents knew a lot of people, so she socialized.
But despite his denials, it isn't long before Sullivan realizes that he's at the top of the suspect list.
We looked at the case as a hit, a murder for hire. We felt strongly that Sullivan had the motive.
Eventually, Sullivan volunteers to take a polygraph test, and he passes.
You can't force someone to take a polygraph test. So people agree to it because they were telling the truth, and they want the police to know that and get the suspicion off themselves.
Many times in a homicide, you pursue hundreds of leads that are determined to be unfounded or not correct, and that's got to be done in order to satisfactorily identify the real suspect.
But in the process of eliminating Jim Sullivan as a suspect, they learn that he's been seeing a young woman in Palm Beach named Suki Rogers.
She became a person of interest because we were trying to eliminate everybody as a suspect. Suki was the girlfriend and Sullivan was still married. So obviously she would become a suspect because she could have a motive for wanting Lita out of the way.
Rogers gives police an alibi, but not much else. Meanwhile, Ed Wheeler, the man who sent Lita the postcard found at the crime scene, is brought in for questioning. He tells police that Lita and Jim both wanted him to testify in their divorce proceedings. Feeling trapped, he decided not to testify for either, but he didn't have the heart to tell Lita in person, so he sent the card. The story seems plausible enough, but it doesn't let Wheeler off the hook, and he remains a person of interest in the case.
Until we know what we got, like, you can't just say, well, this person is eliminated. You can't do that. So you just go in with an open mind, but you go in with an open mind and you're cautious.
Investigators' next move is to focus on the roses that the shooter delivered to the house.
We knew that flowers were involved in the homicide, so we reached out and paid a visit to all of the local florist shops. And that sort of panned out for us because we actually came up with an individual in one of the flower shops.
What kind of flowers?
And Randall Benson was in charge of the flower shop. He was able to give us a description of the people who came in and purchased some flowers.
Benson tells police that around 8 a.m. on the day of the murder, two men were anxiously waiting for the flower shop to open. One stayed behind in the car, while the other followed him into the store.
Benson said that this guy looked like he was kind of weather beaten, kind of worn. Randall was in the process of wrapping up the flowers, and he said the guy was in a hurry. He said, listen, stop, just let me have them. He said, well, what about the card? He said, I don't want a card. And I think he might have used a curse word to decline the card.
He threw a $20 bill at him and left without accepting the change.
15 minutes later, Lita lay bleeding on her foyer floor with those same roses by her side.
Randall Benson was brought down to the homicide unit where he was able to work with an artist to give us a composite drawing of the suspect.
Randall also provides a description of the man who stayed behind in the car. And while neither sketch matches the composite supplied by Lita's neighbor, it's still a big break for police.
Now, whether he was the shooter or not, I don't know. But it gives rise to the opinion that he was involved in some way.
Hoping that someone can identify one of the mystery men, the sketches are published in a local newspaper. And it's not long before they prompt a hot tip from an anonymous caller. The caller is not named, and therefore it's unknown whether he or she is a convict.
In any investigation, we get information and investigative leads from many different types of people.
The caller tells police that one of the composites looks a lot like a guy he used to know, who's got a reputation for shooting people. But investigators' interest is piqued when they learn where the man in question lives, Macon, Georgia, the same town Lita and Jim called home for 6 years.
The investigation was an open book, and everybody was a suspect, and every lead could have possibly been the lead that we needed. So we followed each one of them as they came in to put together a puzzle of what transpired.
The FBI Laboratory's Special Project Unit, or SPU, is staffed with a team of art specialists that not only create composite sketches, but also crime scene reconstructions, animated and interactive 2D and 3D digital models, diagrams, maps, charts, and other visual aids to help solve cases. Less than 4 weeks after Lita Sullivan is shot dead in her own doorway, police have a lead. An anonymous caller has identified a known hitman who also happens to live in Lita's old hometown of Macon, Georgia.
So we went there to try to locate the person, to try to get pictures, to try to do a sort of a background investigation on that person. We found out that he had actually died while he was in jail. Make a long story short, that turned out to be a dead end.
It's another blow to the investigation, and once again, police find themselves back at square one.
Homicide investigations are long, tedious, and sometimes they can be frustrating, particularly when you reach the point where you run out of leads. The good thing about homicide investigations is that they're never closed, and there's always the possibility that one day you'll get that bit of information that you need to solve the case.
But just as the case appears to have gone completely cold, police receive another promising tip.
In about 1991, Johnny Austin Turner, a career criminal, came forward with information that Clinton Botts and a Thomas Bruce Henley were involved in the Lita Sullivan homicide. We deemed it to be credible, and we certainly pursued it with a vengeance because no one at the time was in custody. Turner indicated that Henley had bragged about this and that he had also seen Henley in possession of a 9mm Smith & Wesson, which was determined to be the murder weapon.
A background check reveals that both Henley and Botts have criminal records. Botts had been incarcerated for burglary, while Henley served time for burglary and aggravated assault.
We were looking for the flower purchases, and Henley did have a similarity to one of the composites. They were unemployed career criminals and clearly good suspects in this case.
Police locate the two men and bring them in for questioning, but they deny any involvement. And when police interrogate their informant, Johnny Turner, again, he implicates a third man. His name is Marvin Marable.
I don't know Turner's motive other than I can't see into his head, but I do think it was to receive consideration with his sentence. He was incarcerated and possibly lighten the load on him and how much time he would have to serve if this is deemed to be plausible and good information.
Although leery of Turner's motivation, police look up Marvin Marable. To their surprise, he turns out to be the ex-husband of Lita's best friend, Poppy, and an ex-cop.
Marvin Marable was a smart man, very articulate man, quiet, a person who would exercise his Fifth Amendment rights, just refused to cooperate, other than the fact that he would give you his name and he would acknowledge the fact that he knew Mrs. Sullivan, but that was about it.
His evasiveness prompts investigators to dig a little deeper.
We had reason to believe, because of information that we had developed, that Marvin might have been a little bit jealous of the relationship between Lita and Poppy. Poppy and Lita were spending a tremendous amount of time together, and Marvin had some problems as a result of that with his wife, and that they were possibly about to end up going through divorce proceedings themselves.
That's when Marvin Marable makes a decision that will come back to haunt him.
Marvin recorded some telephone conversations that took place between Lita Sullivan and Poppy. And some of those conversations were pertaining to the divorce.
The tapes include details concerning the divorce Lita Sullivan was seeking from her husband. For a price, the ex-cop eventually shares those tapes with Jim Sullivan. But when Poppy learns about them, she tells Lita, who in turn informs the police. And Marable is ultimately charged with invasion of privacy.
How much did you get for those tapes when you sold them to someone?
Marvin was considered a suspect. He had a motive to see Lita harmed. So we was actively looking at Marvin to try to determine what his role would have been.
According to Johnny Turner, Marvin Marable was working directly with Thomas Bruce Henley and Clinton Botts. But that association soon unravels as both ex-cons are cleared of any participation.
All of that information was checked. They were interviewed, interrogated, they were polygraphed, we did search warrants, and we used every investigative technique available to us.
With no evidence that Marable was involved either, police find themselves at another standstill. But the ex-cop remains a person of interest.
When we're looking at Marvin as playing some role in the homicide, we're not sure at this point specifically what that role was.
Meanwhile, Emery and Joanne McClinton, Lita Sullivan's parents, have their own suspicions. From the beginning, they've been convinced that their son-in-law is somehow to blame. And they paint an unflattering picture of Lita and Jim's stormy relationship.
James Sullivan was a self-made, millionaire, entrepreneur who liked jewelry and fancy cars. And in 1977, married Lita McClinton, a young woman from a very prominent black family.
A few years later, Sullivan decides the couple should leave Georgia for a more glamorous lifestyle.
He takes Lita to Palm Beach, which is very much old money, very connected people, and he arrives on the scene with a black female younger than he, which is not accepted in that community.
But by 1985, it has become clear that Lita will never fit into Jim's new social circle in Florida, so she moves back to Atlanta.
He continues his lifestyle down there, fancy-free, making the connections and traveling within the circle of friends that he had established without her.
Married, but living separate lives, Lita Sullivan eventually decides to file for divorce from her husband of 11 years.
Sullivan, at the time of the homicide, was in serious financial straits. The victim was an impediment to Sullivan's financial well-being.
Lita was looking toward at least one half of all of his assets in the divorce proceeding.
In December 1991, 4 years after their beloved daughter's murder, the McClintons file a wrongful death suit against Jim Sullivan.
It's a civil proceeding in which, if found guilty, the jury awards a certain amount of money in damages.
They hope to sway the jury with startling revelations made by Sullivan's now estranged third wife, Suki.
She was afraid for her life. Jim had told her the same thing that happened to Lita could happen to her, which directly inferred that he was responsible for what happened to Lita. Suki felt that Jim Sullivan would take her life if the circumstances warranted it.
Disclosures in the civil suit against Jim Sullivan move him back to the top of the suspect list. And federal prosecutors launch a criminal case as well.
The federal government decided to move on that with minimal evidence, and as a result, they wanted to conduct a search warrant of his residence in Palm Beach.
Atlanta investigators team up with the FBI to search Sullivan's home.
We didn't discover anything that directly linked him to the homicide of Lita Sullivan.
But his phone records may tell a different story.
So we started looking at them for that particular date, the date of the homicide. And on that log of telephone calls, we saw one that was made from the Atlanta area in the 404 area to Palm Beach. And what struck me strange about it was the fact that it was during the time that we anticipated that the murder took place. And I just had the gut feeling, and I said, this right here is the key to this murder.
In 1991, Atlanta investigators looking into the murder of Lita Sullivan uncover evidence of a strange telephone call made to Lita's husband, Jim, shortly after she was killed. They are hopeful it will serve as compelling evidence in the civil and federal trials against him. And when authorities track down the source of the call, it only deepens their suspicions.
Some anonymous person picked up, and the person replied and said, no, man, this is a rest stop. It's up 85 outside of Swanee, outside the Falcons training camp.
The phone records put the time of the call at exactly 45 minutes after the shooting. So as a next step, investigators map out the route between Lita Sullivan's condo and the rest stop where the call took place.
We had a stopwatch. We left the house on Slayton Drive, and we proceeded down to the expressway. And our plan was to ride on the expressway, watching the stopwatch until the necessary amount of time went by. And once it did, we would look at where we were.
3/4 of an hour later,
We were at a rest stop off the expressway. We went to the first payphone, and to my surprise, it actually matched the number that was on the phone records that we had obtained from Jim Sullivan's.
police theorized that the shooter used the payphone at the rest stop to let Jim Sullivan know that the deed was done.
Merry Christmas.
The telephone call was quite short. We're talking about less than a minute. Perhaps just long enough to call and say, it's done, we've left.
Though compelling, the dots connecting Sullivan to Lita's murder are sketchy at best. And Jim Sullivan remains unruffled when confronted with the information. He has no trouble discrediting it, pointing out that he has many friends in Atlanta and that the call could have come from any of them. He also uses the results of his polygraph in his defense.
When people lie, the stress of lying shows itself physiologically in their cardiovascular system, heartbeat, pulse rate, and their breathing patterns, and other involuntary physiological indicators. So the polygraph is based on the idea that it is stressful to lie, and the instrument picks up evidence of that stress.
Jim Sullivan's polygraph showed no signs of stress, suggesting he had no involvement in his wife's murder. Citing lack of evidence, the judge throws out the entire federal case.
But what you're lacking is that missing middle link, the shooter, if you will. And though you know this, you can't successfully prosecute.
In Florida, however, the civil case does not go as well for Jim Sullivan. In February 1994, the jury finds Sullivan culpable in the wrongful death of his wife. They award Lita's family $4 million in damages, but before they see a penny of it, they are told the statute of limitations has run out. The Florida Supreme Court lets Sullivan off the hook.
I feel as though at that point we're closer to a solution, but we're not quite there. We're still without the flower purchasers and the shooter.
But just as the investigation appears to have stalled out for good, authorities get a hot tip that threatens to blow the case wide open. A lawyer in Houston has a client who claims to have credible information about the Sullivan murder, 35-year-old Belinda Trahan.
She began to tell me what had taken place several years earlier when she dated and lived with a man named Tony Harwood. But what Belinda told me specifically was that she felt threatened by Harwood because he had been involved in a murder for hire.
When investigators fly to Texas to check it out, they hear a story of love gone terribly sour.
Belinda Trahan met Tony Harwood in Texas when she was living out there years ago. She left Texas to live with him in Albemarle, North Carolina. He was a long-distance truck driver, and she would go with him on his trips.
We were running from state to state, moving people, hardly ever at home, living out of a truck.
Then, in November of 1986, Harwood gets a job moving a wealthy man from Georgia to Florida. But tired of life on the road, Belinda refuses to go along.
Well, when he came back, he was acting strange. And I asked him, I said, "What's with you?" And he says, "The least you know, the better off you are."
Harwood eventually confesses to Belinda that the man he just moved to Florida has hired him to kill his wife.
And I just didn't believe that. I didn't believe it at all.
But when Harwood returns home from his next trip, he assures Belinda that the deed is done.
Belinda laughed, and he said, "No, I'm serious. If you don't believe me, come with me. I'll take you to meet the man, and you can be present when he pays me."
He told me, "Come on, I want to take you somewhere."
In January 1987, a skeptical Belinda Trahan travels to a Florida diner with her boyfriend, Tony Harwood. He insists he's there to get paid for killing a rich man's wife, but Belinda isn't buying it.
In comes this guy, a tall, lanky guy, and he just didn't look like he belonged there. He looked like he belonged, on a yacht. And he looks over at Harwood and he says, "What is she doing here?" And Harwood says, "It's okay."
Then the man pushes a folded newspaper across the table to Harwood.
And there's a large envelope in there, and it's got money in it. He just fanned it. And then I thought, oh my God. Now I'm in fear for my life.
Terrified, Belinda leaves Harwood and flees back to her hometown in Texas.
He would call me, tell me that he's gonna kill me. He's gonna kill me. He's gonna do this and that. He has always threatened me, called me constantly since 1987. I was afraid.
Investigators then ask Belinda if she can identify the man who paid Harwood that night at the diner.
When I pointed him out, they asked me how sure I was of it, and I said, I'm 99% sure that's him.
Belinda identifies Jim Sullivan, Lita's estranged husband, as the mastermind behind her cold-blooded murder.
I was the only one that could link the face of Sullivan to Harwood.
Investigators waste no time devising a trap to snare Harwood. But in order for it to work, Belinda will have to serve as bait.
That was the only way that we could get Harwood to admit to where he was at. My feelings towards it was something I need to do, I want to do.
My instructions to her was just have a normal conversation and to kind of go back over the murder. Tony Harwood began coaching Belinda on what to say to law enforcement. So, you know, to have his voice on there talking about the murder was overwhelming evidence.
But investigators aren't satisfied just yet. They still need to establish a hard link between Harwood and the Sullivans.
And I went to the moving company that Tony had worked at, and I found the contract where Jim Sullivan and Tony Harwood both signed off on the moving agreement.
The contract, along with the tape recordings, is enough to secure an arrest warrant for Tony Harwood.
We took Harwood into custody, and the first thing that he said when we picked him up was, "I've been waiting for you guys for a long time." So after that, everything just fell into place. We were convinced that we had the right person.
Authorities' next step is to convince Harwood to cooperate. They believe they have their shooter, but it's the mastermind they really want.
The mastermind mistakenly believes that if they get someone else to commit the murder, they're going to be home free because they have an alibi.
Tony Harwood told us that he met Jim Sullivan when he picked up a load of furniture from Macon, Georgia, and transported it to Palm Beach to Jim Sullivan's mansion. He and Sullivan had a conversation regarding having Sullivan's wife bumped off.
But he remains evasive about his own role in the murder.
Harwood claimed, and no one believed him, that he was just a getaway driver. He was just the real trigger man's accomplice. But in my opinion, Harwood was the assassin.
Tony Harwood indicated that there was other people involved. However, he said that he did not know who they were, none of which we believed. We believed that Tony Harwood acted in concert with others that he did know.
But investigators have no evidence as to who those accomplices might be. They also concede that neither Ed Wheeler nor Marvin Marable had any involvement in the crime and officially drop each of them as a person of interest. Harwood eventually pleads guilty to voluntary manslaughter in exchange for agreeing to testify against Sullivan. And in April 1998, Atlanta police issue a murder warrant for his arrest.
Sullivan ran immediately. When Harwood was arrested, I have no doubt in my mind that Sullivan was notified, whether it be via an immediate account, attorney, don't know who, but he was notified and he immediately fled.
Suddenly, federal and local authorities find themselves on a worldwide manhunt.
We're never concerned about whether or not we're going to find Mr. Sullivan. We just know that it's going to be a lengthy investigation, especially somebody that has the money that Mr. Sullivan had.
With his millions of dollars, Sullivan could realistically be anywhere.
You know, if Jim Sullivan had the opportunity, that he would have any one of the witnesses killed, and people were in fear.
I went into hiding, and we actually have a crawl space in our house, and I was living up beneath the house with my 357 and just waiting for them to find out something, where he was, where'd he go. I was very scared, and I was very scared for my family.
Unfortunately, finding Sullivan is no easy task, and by 2002, all leads have gone stale. It is then that investigators decide to use the media to their advantage.
America's Most Wanted has always been a friend of law enforcement. They've always been very helpful in assisting in locating fugitives, especially fugitives that are very difficult to catch.
In the program's wake, 3 different tips come in from Thailand. When Thai authorities investigate, they discover that Sullivan had in fact entered the country in 1998 and has been living in an upscale beach community ever since. His neighbors are shocked to learn that they have a suspected murderer in their midst.
The surprising aspect of many of these murder-for-hire cases is actually the identity of the mastermind, people that you would never expect would be capable of such a cold-blooded crime. And these people could include, successful business people, politicians, lawyers, physicians.
On July 3rd, 2002, Jim Sullivan's long holiday finally comes to an end.
He was in total shock and disbelief that he had been located and continued to deny any involvement in the murder of his wife.
19 years since Lita Sullivan was shot and killed, the wheels of justice finally begin to turn when Jim Sullivan finds himself back in a U.S. courtroom. But he's still defiant, pleading not guilty and maintaining his innocence to the bitter end.
These people don't look like monsters, but there's something inside them that's broken. They have these terrible personality disorders that don't manifest itself until they commit these crimes. And then we're left wondering, how could anyone do such a thing?
The prosecution paints a portrait of a man driven by greed.
He felt that his financial well-being was more important than his wife's life. So that the only way he could get out of this was to have his wife murdered. He could see no alternative. And so he had her killed.
Sullivan decides not to testify at his own trial, but Belinda Trahan and Tony Harwood do.
Murder for hire is difficult to get away with because between the time that the mastermind meets the hitman and the time of the murder, there are all kinds of people involved. And the mastermind's fingerprints are really all over the crime, even though they're not at the scene of the crime.
In March 2006, Sullivan is found guilty of felony murder. At the age of 64, he is sentenced to life without parole.
He looked like he was just numb to everything. He didn't show much emotion of any kind.
With nearly 2 decades of investigative work behind them, FBI agents and local police can finally close the book on Jim Sullivan. But many still wonder how he was able to pass the polygraph test so many years ago.
Well, the polygraph detects the stress associated with lying. Now, a sociopath or a pathological liar who actually can either convince himself that he's telling the truth or has no stress whatsoever in lying isn't going to react.
Sullivan just felt as though he was smarter and better than everyone, and I think there's a sense of satisfaction when you pursue someone like that and ultimately try and convict them that he got exactly what he deserved.
What I can't get over in murder-for-hire cases is that otherwise intelligent and successful people would do such a thing. It's the cold-blooded, premeditated nature of this kind of homicide that's the most disturbing.